Hello, everyone. It is March 3rd, 2020, and you are listening to episode 9 of the Mid-Season Replacements podcast. I am your host, Randy Dankovich, the man behind TV Never Sleeps, and the TV editor at GoombaStomp.com. With me, a man who was recently exposed to the trend of squeak rap, is Sean Coletti. Sean, how do you feel about squeak rap?
That's a whole podcast, isn't it?
I mean, it's definitely longer than just an average segment. I honestly cannot stop listening to that song that I sent you. I'm so fascinated by how horrible it is.
Yeah, you sent it to me, and you send me a lot of things periodically, and much of them are jokey things, and I thought this was. But are you taking this seriously?
This is not a satire. I mean, this guy has done other videos like explaining why he's doing this. And if, for those who are unfamiliar, I'm talking about this guy called 645AR. He released a song in January called 4 to Trap, the number 4. And it sounds like a chipmunk did a bunch of cocaine and wanted to make a song about the street life and decided to do exactly that and decided to not pitch correct his voice at all. So it's squeak rap is the way to describe it. I mean, there's really no other way. And this guy, what's funny is this guy doesn't see this as like his complete gimmick. Like he's like, I want to squeak rap, I want to regular rap, I want to sing, I want to squeak sing. It's like just he considers as a component of his personality, which I can kind of admire, but that song haunts me like a nightmare.
Who's the guy who did The Room?
Tommy Wiseau?
Yeah, maybe this guy is the Tommy Wiseau of hip-hop then.
Maybe he should score Tommy Wiseau. Like, let Tommy Wiseau make the Joker movie that he wants to make on Twitter so badly and let this guy score it.
Well, that's it for us this week.
Fuck yourself, Todd Phillips. Yeah, let's go. So, with that, I'm not going to do any housekeeping anymore. If at this point you guys know who we are with the mid-season replacements, and you know where to find us. This week we are, a couple weeks ago we did our feature on, we debuted the Action TV Hall of Fame, and we've wanted to find other ways to do kind of regular series that look back at other shows a bit, especially shows from the last decade, because of just how inundated we all were and unprepared I think our industry was to kind of absorb all this stuff. I think, in this day and age, in 2020, people have realized that there's kind of two classes of shows. There's shows that critics want to pay attention to and shows that critics are never going to pay attention to. They've separated it out a little bit. But back then it was the Wild West. So one of the things that we thought about doing, because we really like to be nerdy and dig into the art and history of scenes, is just do a series based on great scenes that we see. So we sat down, we picked 20 shows in total to have and to choose from, and as a pool of like shows that we thought we could find interesting things to discuss about. And then we kind of started thinking about those shows kind of along 3 different criteria. We've got the shows scenes that feature great acting, scenes that feature great writing, and scenes that feature great direction, kind of the 3 main pillars of any great television scene. Most of the stuff we'll talk about have all of them, but that was kind of our defining criteria for picking the selections we did. Before we introduce them, Sean, I didn't know, do you have any thoughts you want to share about kind of the conception of this idea and why we decided to highlight it?
Yeah, well, with a lot of podcasts, especially probably TV ones, now that TV is so expansive, like, the pressure, I think, is no longer there to be comprehensive. It would be foolish to do so.
It's insanity.
But even, I guess, going in the opposite direction, it's probably important to narrow the focus down as far as possible. Like, you rarely get these dissection of a scene kind of analyses outside of maybe cinephiles. Like, a lot of YouTube channels devoted to the history and the art of filmmaking might do this occasionally, and it happens less often in TV.
And a lot of the times the stuff in TV is like piggybacking off the worst of video, like film criticism on YouTube, where it's just nitpicking, holes in logic and continuity errors and dumb bullshit like that. Like, while we're here, fuck you, CinemaSins, for your continued existence.
Yeah. I think another thing I just thought of now, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is to first acknowledge that we only have so much language with which to talk about these things. Like ideally, in the coming months, we'd be able to do some interviews with actors to talk about the process of acting and what technically makes good acting. I think as viewers, when we see good acting, we could recognize it as, "Ooh, this is very good," but we don't take the time to think about why that is, and maybe during the course of this conversation, we can touch on that. I guess I feel qualified to talk about writing, which is going to be the third one that we talk about. Or no, sorry, the second one. But when it comes to acting and directing, I've never taken acting classes. I've never studied direction in any way other than, just watching breakdowns online.
You've never watched the Kaminsky Method, I presume?
I have never watched the Kaminsky Method.
That's a joke for everyone, but it's a show that features acting classes. Again, we selected 3 scenes. Obviously we had a pool of thousands to choose from because of, how much great shit is out there.
Yeah, do you want to talk about how we chose not to do some things for reasons?
Yeah. So I guess part of that was, we picked, before we even picked our pool of 20 shows, that's going to be kind of the first group of shows that we pull from over the next few months to a year or whatever it may be. We decided that we should stay away from our own cliches and ban certain shows. So we've banned 8 shows from discussion. 4 are personal bans that we've made as the shows that we discuss enough as it is. I think shows that are going to even come up in these conversations sometimes. So I think for the time being, at least, we can leave them out. The 4 shows that we universally decided to ban just because we feel like they are probably the most analyzed shows in television history. Breaking Bad, Mad Men, The Wire, The Sopranos. We all know their prowess and their greatness. I'm sure one day we'll break our rule when we're old and gray and decide to talk about something in one of these shows. But, at least for the time being, we really want to challenge ourselves to step outside the box. I'll mention the 4 shows that we picked personally as well. Anybody who listens to this show will not be surprised by these picks. Hannibal, Lost, Banshee, and Game of Thrones. Sorry, but you guys are disqualified. You did not make any great scenes. They were all magnificent. And thus, we cannot discuss you here.
I'm glad we did this as well. It's to avoid personal bias and to avoid the shows that all the other critics talk about too much. So it was a good idea.
And with that, I think we should just kind of jump into it.
Sorry to interrupt you. We also should just say that we're dedicating, I guess, this portion of the episodes, as it has to do with acting, to... Okay. No problem.
So to get started, I think the best way for us to do this is to focus on the show we selected for acting. With all 3 of these shows, we'll talk about all the different aspects of what makes these scenes interesting and what draws us to them. But, we did have specific criteria that we used to kind of force ourselves into a box to actually pick a scene and not just talk about the things we love for 3 hours. But I want to start with acting this week. This was on Sean's suggestion. I think it's a great one. Kind of as our personal tribute to James Lipton, who passed away earlier this week at age 93. There are a lot of things to admire about James Lipton. I think the thing that I will remember most about him is he is a guy who found the greatest success in his career at age 68 when he decided to start the show inside the actor's studio. And, we were talking off air and I was like, he became kind of the Nardwuar of film criticism because he was able to... He would sit down with actors and meet with them on their level to talk about the craft. And, he was not somebody who was pretentious about it or took himself too seriously. He was willing to joke and be joked on. But his appreciation for the craft and his ability to challenge actors by pushing them away from the normal questions of why'd you make this choice to close your eyes in this scene. He would pull obscure facts out of their past and acting choices that they made and challenge them, kind of put them on the spot to challenge them and to offer them something, offer something to the audience to reveal of themselves that I don't think you'd really get in any other interview. His show ended, I believe it ended 2 or 3 years ago. It was on air for like 20 years. This guy worked, like I said, he started this show at 68 and finished when he was like pushing 90, which I think is something we can all.
Yeah. One of the things that I find most valuable in other people is passion, and hearing James Lipton talk about the films that he's seen and the performances that he's seen across from so many incredible, recognizable actors, male and female. His passion for the craft was undeniable, and even if you aren't necessarily interested in the ins and outs of acting, it was still something worth watching, that was entertaining, that was interesting, and even if you weren't trying to, that you'd learn something from.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about him before we move on is, I'm sure it was the same for you growing up, the big pillars of this stuff for fans, people that were cinephiles like you and I, were, you'd read Robert Ebert's reviews of everything, and you'd watch James Lipton interview people. And the thing that I always liked, I loved both of their work, and I appreciate them. They were huge influences on my decision to do this stuff throughout my life. But the thing I always appreciated about James Lipton is he never put himself in the shoes of a critic, so he could express his appreciation for all film and all performance. He would talk to actors about random obscure things and terrible movies that he sat through 2 hours of joyously just so he could ask this 30-second question. And in a day and age where, there's almost too much content, as two guys talk on a television podcast on the internet in 2020, there's almost too much content around as we're all trying to compete in this space, and it robs us a bit of having, occasionally, I think sometimes I try and put this in my writing, but it robs us of having that personal touch, and I think Ebert always did that, but I always loved the way James Lipton did it just a little bit more, because the guy was so genuine. You could tell there wasn't a sour bone in his body. He never came at an actor and was like, yo, this sucked, why'd you do this? He would always try and dig a little bit deeper than that and find something more thoughtful to bring out of somebody. And it's something we can all aim to do, I think, not only as professional film critics, but just as people, is to, look for a little something more in somebody.
Which is why we're going to begin with great acting.
Yes, we're going to talk about great acting and the people that make us feel things. With every one of these, I'll set it up by kind of introducing the show and the clip for people that are unfamiliar with it. The show we selected for acting was Rectify. It's a show that could have made it into the pillar of untouchables that we discussed earlier, but I'm glad that it didn't, because I think it is one of the most richly performed shows in the history of all television. Forget just the peak TV era that I know a lot of our attention focuses on. But anyway, we'll get into that. The scene we're talking about is from Season 1, Episode 6, Jacob's Ladder. It's the finale of the first season. It was written and directed by Ray McKinnon. And the scene that we are specifically discussing is towards the end of the episode. It begins when Daniel, our protagonist, goes to visit the grave of the woman he was convicted of killing and spent 20 years in prison for. And it cuts from that moment to the first season, and the second season a little bit has a lot of flashbacks to the time that Daniel spent on death row. For those unfamiliar with the show, the series begins with him not being found not guilty or being exonerated, but basically being released from prison on a technicality. And the show is about him. It's about a man trying to find salvation in a world that's forgotten him. The scene is a flashback that goes back to the moment that the only friend he had while he was on death row, a black man named Kerwin, it's his final moment. The only moment where they ever get to see each other face to face, given that they both live in isolation. And it's a moment that they share before Kerwin goes to be executed. So before we get into it, here's a clip.
Daniel, Daniel, I need to say something to my friend.
Doesn't look like he wants to speak to you.
I just need a moment. Need to go? Please.
It's okay.
Look at me. Look at me, brother. Daniel. I know he didn't do it.
How do you know?
Because I know you. Because I know you. Because I know you.
All right. If I know how to edit a podcast correctly, you will just have heard a clip from Rectify's Jacob's Ladder. And I'll let you start with this, Sean, because I have a lot. There's a lot in this scene for me as a person who experienced a lot emotionally going through Rectify as a series. So I'm curious as to your thoughts as to what sticks out from you with the scene of Daniel and Kerwin meeting each other through a pane of glass and then saying goodbye.
The first thing that jumps out is how we've decided to pick this scene using acting as the entry point, which would imply that the dynamic between the two performances is going to be something really incredible. And Aiden Young has 4 words that he says in this whole scene, which is a testament across the board to what the cast of Rectify does by being able to act through body language. In this case, facial expressions. Aiden Young throughout Rectify was incredible at being able to evoke different kinds of nostalgia and sadness. And this is one of the most heartbreaking ones. Looking just at this scene, it's hard because there's a lot of stuff in the first 5 episodes that you want to bring to it. But the way that we only get the initial... So once Kerwin is out the window and the conversation between the two has begun, except for one line which is repeated, we get the dialogue spoken to us from the other side of the window.
We're never in the cell with Daniel during this scene. You know, it's a scene that's being reenacted from his memory, but you know, almost the metaphor of the small window pane on their door, I think, is really fitting for like just how little of a glimpse we're able to get into Daniel's mind because of the kind of person that he is and the trauma that he's been through, and of like what a rich, fulfilling friendship those two men could have had with each other had they been under circumstances. And instead, they get to exchange. They have some conversations between walls, but they literally see each other face to face for 2 seconds. It's probably the last human being, the last compassionate human being face that Kerwin ever sees during his life.
And even as somebody who grew up on the West Coast, Southern hospitality, I think, is something that Southerners are really proud of. And even if you are like the most coastal liberal person in the world, like there's something really warm and intoxicating about the way that Southerners speak, like the actual syntax and the words that they choose. And this is such a devastating sequence, but it's performed in a way that feels quite relaxed, less dramatic, and would it have even been less dramatic without the music attached to it? Like, it just feels like a very lived-in scene, and this is what Rectify does throughout. There's nothing like really heightened about it. There's nothing very loud about any of these performances, and they're much more powerful because of that.
Yeah, there's probably 20 to, I didn't count the actual, syllables, but there's probably 20 to 30 words spread across this 2.5 minute scene. So it's really on the performers, Aiden Young playing Daniel and Johnny Ray Guild playing Kerwin, to be able to find the emotional space between each other to just kind of express like the psychological toll that this experience has had on them both. Forget, this is not a scene that is concerned with condemning a man to death or establishing a meaningful relationship or even trying to decide whether Daniel or Kerwin are guilty or innocent. Because in the eyes of the system, that part doesn't matter. These officers are showing up to his cell because they got some paperwork that said this guy has to be brought to this place and jolted with X amount of volts of electricity or given this, and it's so clinical and separated. And I think it would have been easy for that interaction between the two of them, the words they exchanged with Kerwin trying to get him to come to the door, and when Daniel finally does, his reluctance to even meet his gaze and say goodbye to the only thing that he's been able to attach his personality to. How that moment speaks to where both of those characters are, and even something larger like I think part of Rectify does focus on just how inhumane the criminal justice system is, and whether that's right or whether that's wrong. And the weight of that can be felt in that moment so much by two guys that have so many things that they would want in any other circumstance would want to express to each other, knowing that this is the last interaction that they're going to have. But instead we get this almost detached simplicity. Like they both understand that this is inevitable, and they have been crushed by the boot of the system. Whether right or wrong is that part doesn't matter. In a series that so often paints the contrast between how much value there is in being with other people, like you speak to that notion of Southern hospitality. I think it goes beyond the syntax and just to this very notion of not being alone, and that just brief moment of those two having the sense that they're not alone for 30 seconds and being able to actually visualize that. It gives the entire episode so much arc and so much power in this moment Daniel's facing, where he doesn't realize if he's trying to decide if he should leave his hometown or not, and whether he should have gotten out of prison at all, and trying to figure out, at this point it's been so long, and he's so mentally traumatized by everything that's gone on, like he doesn't even know if he committed this crime or not. So to have that moment, as tragic as it is, occur where and when it does, it's masterful in a way. And that's not a phrase that I use very often. It is just an absolute masterpiece from conception to execution that you can imagine. I mean, this is television working at its highest level. I don't care what you say about big Game of Thrones action scenes or flashy comedies on broadcast networks or what have you. This is what makes television great, are scenes like this.
Another version of this show that was interested in other aspects of it. So we have this season finale in which throughout these 6 episodes you wonder to some degree about whether or not Daniel did it. We learn by watching Rectify that this isn't important, but a show that is interested in that, this flashback that happens at Hannah's grave would be one that takes place with her, that gives more information about that. But instead, the flashback at Hannah's grave reminds Daniel of somebody else that he's lost, to whom he was incredibly close. And like you said, trying to figure out whether he should be staying or leaving his hometown, this was somebody to whom he turned for advice, even if it wasn't explicit. It was just the conversations between the two of them, spoken through walls, that I think really helped each other. And I think dialogue is probably one of the easiest things for me to latch on to. And when Kerwin's initially trying to get Daniel's attention, it's not working. And finally, when he's at the window, he says, "Look at me, brother." That to me is also a cue somewhere in Daniel's head. I think it's Amantha in this series, who's the character that he's closest to, whose sister, who would say those words in a sentence. So in some ways, I think Kerwin stirs that up in him and reminds him about how important it is to keep going. One of the other scenes that we were considering for this happens in the next episode, the season 2 premiere. And it is about that, whether or not life is worth trying to carry on, even if the circumstances seem as dire as they do. And it can't get much worse than death row in this context. So I thought that was an interesting choice of words. There's a brotherly relationship there anyway, but I think that it has an added dimension when you consider Daniel's actual siblings.
Well, a lot of what their relationship reminds me are the stories you hear, or even, plenty of films have been made about this, but I'm thinking of different biographies I've read over the years about people who go to war and have a shared traumatic experience together, and kind of how a deeper relationship or sense of attachment can form between people that only know each other in passing. I think of World War II stories about, veterans that are haunted by the images of people that they spent 2 weeks with in the middle of France, only to watch them get shot down before they could even learn their last name or who their family was or anything like that. You can feel all of that weight in that scene, and a lesser show would have that same moment but play it up for the sadness of it all. And what really, really strikes me about that scene is that it's not sad, it's almost hopeful about it, but not in a way that trivializes Kerwin's character. Because I think that's the other thing that this show does, is it avoids the tropes of using the lives of brown people to justify the emotions and to catalyze the journey of our white protagonist. And I think this show subverts that in a lot of interesting ways, but I think in this scene in particular, it does so by not trying to do anything at all, really. It just lets that moment exist as it is, without drama. Even you mentioned the score behind it. I think a score on a contemplative series is very important and can, to the point where it can almost be exploitative, but I think it's subdued enough here that it gives poetry to what could be remembered as a more depressing moment for Daniel's journey. And I think, like you said, that moment really gives Daniel pause, and when he's reconsidering it about, the value of his own life. And, the scene is importantly followed by him getting the shit beat out of him by just a number of kids in the town who either know his reputation, think he's guilty, or what have you. But Rectify was always beautiful at finding that juxtaposition between the beautiful and the ugly in life, no matter who the person was, whether they were a good person or an awful person. And I think it does so in that moment almost wordlessly, and it's poetry in motion. It's a cliche you hear a lot, but it's something that it's an apt descriptor for that minute 40 seconds that we get at the end of that season.
I think that it is hopeful, especially for Daniel, for somebody to say and for Daniel to believe that Kerwin knows him. And that's the line that's repeated, because I know you. And this is what breaks Daniel down. And I guess I'd also just want to. I don't even know how to do justice to this, really. The entire cast of Rectify is incredible, but there's something about Aidan Young's performance as Daniel Holden that is next level in a way where, like, if you stacked up the perennial Emmy nominees and winners like Bryan Cranston from Breaking Bad or John Hamm from Mad Men, I genuinely, this is not me exaggerating, genuinely wouldn't even give it a second thought. Like, Aidan Young in this role is just so much better than anything else that I've seen on TV. When we talk about these kinds of powerhouse performances, they're usually in film, I think, is where we see it most often. And maybe that has to do with the medium, where because you're breaking a story apart into episodes and come back to it and take breaks from it, that it draws you in different ways and not in that kind of blow you over and suck you into this world, into this orbit of this person and their consciousness. I haven't seen anything quite like it on TV, and to me, it ranks up there with the best performances in film as well. And it's something that you really have to see to believe, because if you just watch clips, you're like, there's not really much going on here. And that's very much the point, is that he's doing this with not the same types of scripts that other actors would get.
Yeah, Aidan Young's performance, arguably the most underrated of the past decade, at least for like lead male performances on television shows. I mean, we're talking about a show that at its height maybe had, never had a consistent audience of more than like 180,000 people on a weekly basis. So it would be easy for, people to have missed this. But I mean, if you haven't seen Rectify, if you don't want to watch the whole show, sure, I get it. It's this day and age. It's only 30 some episodes. I think you can watch the first 6 episodes, that first season, and really get a complete journey of a character, and just like a study in how to build a character outside of the normal templates of how we see, writing and performance build showy characters, like you mentioned with Walter White or something like that. There are no dramatic, showy outbursts that we get from, there aren't zero, but the amount of them and the amount that Young's performance relies on them is just so much less than what you'd expect from a high level prestige television performance. It's unassuming in a way that is breathtaking, honestly.
If you're all interested in acting, this is a show really worth diving into. We've spoken at length about Aidan Young, but Abigail Spencer and Adelaide Clemens in this series are incredible. Clayne Crawford
Luke Kirby.
Yep. And in the final season, J. Smith Cameron, who plays Daniel's mom, gets a lot more to do as well. And this whole cast is that they're the poster children for that people that you like to spend time with and you don't want to say goodbye to.
And they're also like, Rectify is like the shining beacon of like the really artsy experimental phase of peak TV. It helps that it's probably one of the 5 to 10 greatest television shows ever made. We could gush and gush about this show for hours, I think. I just think that if you haven't watched this show before, or if you tried to watch an episode and walked away from it thinking that it was like too indie or too tweed to be worth investing in, like, watch through this episode and tell me that you can make it through without. I mean, I can't. I watched this, tried to rewatch this scene before we did the show today, and I was crying in the middle of it. Like, I cannot make it through that 2 minutes of television without losing my shit. And I think that is both something I probably should address in therapy, but I think it's more importantly, it's just like an admirable achievement for what the medium of television is capable of, because this is very much the demarcation point of a 6-hour journey with a character, and it's phenomenal.
Spoiler alert, I think all 3 of the shows that we're talking about might actually be in my top 10.
Yeah, Yeah, they're definitely all within consideration. Like, if I were to sit down and write out a quick draft of, like, here's the 20 shows I'd probably consider, all 3 of these would be in there, no problem. But it's not one of the 4 we're not allowed to talk about, so that's the important part. Let's move on to our next segment, which is the show that we picked based on writing. And I know you said this is kind of your strength, Sean, but this one is the one that I struggled a little bit with. I think to find great television writing, like across an episode or a season, is a lot easier to dig into than trying to figure out what makes great writing in a scene, if that makes sense. I think it's easy to look at the overall structure of an episode and say, oh shit, this is the formal construction of this is genius. Or you look at the arc of a season and say, holy shit, they plan this out so well, or this character arc is so good. But trying to get that to come across in 90 seconds to 2 minutes and not make it feel like, think of the scenes that happen at the end of pilots where, the character either says the title of the show or makes that statement that says, here's the elevator pitch for why we exist and why we matter and why we have feelings. And I think, great writing is stuff that's able to do that without saying that at all. And I think the show we've picked here embodies that perfectly. The show we're going to talk about is HBO's Enlightened, a show that remains a critical favorite, but I still think it's a show that nobody outside of our circle has ever watched. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to convince them to. The episode we're talking about is Season 1, Episode 9, Consider Helen. It's directed by Phil Morrison. It's written by Mike White. The 2 people on the scene that we're talking about are Barbara Barry playing Carol and Diane Ladd playing Helen Jellicoe. The scene, just again for a little bit of context, the scene takes place in the grocery store. The episode, really, I guess I should start there, steps away from Amy Jellicoe's journey as an employee of a shitty corporation and a woman trying to process her own mental trauma that she's gone through. This episode is about her mother, who, after her husband committed suicide following downward spiral in his career, was left to begrudgingly raise 2 daughters on her own, fracturing her relationship with them both. This show is really about Amy's journey, but a lot of it is about her and her mother trying to find common ground as they find themselves living together, even though their relationship is strained. Consider Helen is an episode that focuses directly on Helen. Amy steps out of the frame in the beginning of the episode, not to be seen again, and just traces Helen, and it's all about how her past continues to haunt her and prevent her from being able to... It's frozen her in a certain period of her life where she can only think about what happened in the past and worry about what's happening to her daughter in the future. They visualize it throughout the episode by... she'll be walking around the house and all of a sudden we'll see in the background a picture of her young husband playing with young Amy and her sister, or them hanging out by the pool, or him getting an excited phone call, and then finally at the end of the episode she walks into the garage and we see how he killed himself. But the scene that we're talking about takes place away from all that. Helen goes to the grocery store to get groceries, runs into the wife of a former business partner of her husband. In fact, somebody who we find may be tangentially responsible for part of her husband's career failure, which inevitably led him to suicide. But anyways, the scene takes place with Carol and Helen talking in the grocery store. Before we get into it, here's a clip.
Yeah, he was busy. He always had things going on. I know that Lyle always felt lazy after he had been with Jim. Jim had so many things in the fire. Lyle always looked up to Jim. Well, Carol. Yes?
Then why did he pull out of their deal?
What deal?
The Trellis project was a corporate park. They were in development already with Carl Hewitt.
Well, that was 20 years ago. Helen, I don't even remember that. So,
Carol is so good running into you. really. And you tell your family I said hi.
Okay, and you say hi to Amy and Bethany. And
I'll
next
do
time
it.
Lisa comes into town, we can all get together. I'm sure Lisa would love to see Amy.
Clip you just heard, like I said, was from Season 1, Episode 9 of Enlightened, Consider Helen. Sean, this is a really fucked up scene. Is kind of the only way I can think of how to open this conversation, because it is a scene that is very much written like it is all subtext. These two women are having a conversation about their lives and catching up on their children, and as the scene develops, it slowly shifts from two women just catching up to just slowly draw out how their lives have taken a parallel path, and how one of them was utterly personally destroyed by the ripple effects of one decision, and how somebody else just kind of went on living their life and totally did not give a shit or think twice about it.
The entry for this is how familiar the situation is. So you don't have to be a grandmother who has had a conversation like this before. Chances are, as long as you were fortunate enough to grow up with somebody in that position, whether it was an actual grandparent or a guardian of that age, like these kinds of conversations take place. These very small talky, quick catch up with somebody that you haven't seen in a long time. And you can learn a lot about somebody by how they deal with that kind of situation. And it's very clear that Helen is not comfortable playing that grandma role in this. And that's brought up in the conversation, like as one of the things that is said by Carol that unintentionally makes Helen feel really shitty, like, oh, so no grandkids, because that's one of the things that the older generations stereotypically measure success or happiness by, is what the job situation is, and what the family situation is, and these are things that mean much different, that have different connotations for Helen because of her familial experience and because of where Amy is in her job right now. So this is why we get so many very quick responses that if Carol was more tuned in, would realize are cues like, oh, she doesn't really want to be having this conversation right now. You get a lot of ahs or ohs or great coming from Helen. And I think, yeah, if you're a more aware / empathetic person, you pick up on those conversational cues. And Carol is really just using this opportunity to, again, unintentionally, but like compare lives, and not in a way where it's like mine is more valuable or successful than yours is, but just to see where this other person is, because as you said, they were leading parallel lives, and he just feels so bad for Helen in this instance, and understand why, I want to say snaps, but that implies that it's a bit more verbally violent than it actually is. It's not so aggressive the way that Helen turns the conversation on Carol, realizes what she's done, and then kind of backpedals and says, it was nice to see you, so that it gives Carol an out without feeling super guilty for bringing up Jim. But it's cringy in a very different way than when we refer to cringe comedy. That's kind of just really makes you feel embarrassed, and I think this mostly makes you just feel bad.
Well, I think there's an important shift in tone that happens naturally. It's really where I think the mastery of this writing comes through in the scene. They're talking, and Carol's showing Helen pictures on her phone, and you can tell Helen's in a place where she's like, I'm not having the greatest day, but I'll tolerate this for a couple minutes. Then the woman starts launching into how her daughter's having her third child, and she just wants to be surprised by the gender, and Carol's going, oh, well, I need to know what the gender is so I know what to buy. Do I want to buy pink or blue? And immediately you can see and you can hear Helen's tone shift away from this, copacetic, I'm going to tolerate this bullshit so I can get through my day kind of thing. Because there's just such a contrast drawn between Carol's problems and not knowing which baby clothes to buy, and Helen, who is trying to put herself in a place where she can help her daughter, who's dealing with an alcoholic, drug-riddled ex-husband, and a daughter who's mentally unstable, who has had a miscarriage. There's all these things going on that are not going to come up in these small conversations, of course, but to see that contrast drawn between just how different two acquaintances' lives can play out in the same general vicinity of each other. The assumption here is that they kind of knew each other for a long time and grew up, had their adult lives in the same towns, and their daughters grew up together. But then when she starts asking her about her family, Carol's just totally fucking oblivious to it. But Helen starts to feel the weight of all that's happened to her and all the negativity that's been poured into her life. And understandably, as anybody would, against something that you almost have no control over, she gets so frustrated that she eventually just pulls away. I think, again, we can kind of mention this takes place in California, but this notion of Southern hospitality and being civil with each other and with that kind of letting everything bad stay under the rug. Like, Helen almost whips that rug up there. There's a brief moment where she's like, look, bitch, your husband fucked up our lives, fucked up my husband's life, and this is where I am now. But her need to just be civil and try and find a middle ground with somebody. We see that again later when Amy's going off about work and Helen's struggling through her own preconceptions and notions and prejudices to try and find a place to meet her daughter halfway on what she's going through. And her pushing back ever so briefly against a woman that she knew for decades that is unwilling to do the same is really powerful and gives shape to a character that kind of existed in the background of the narrative for much of Enlightened's first season.
One of the really impressive aspects of this scene in terms of writing is the time that it takes for Carol to feel comfortable enough to mention Jim. And I'm going to bring some of me into this. I don't know if that's something that we should do, but it's an easy way for me to talk about how good the writing is.
Go off, Carol.
So years ago, the closest person in my life committed suicide as well. So anybody who knows me well knows that part about me. And there's this dynamic where when you encounter somebody like this, like, you kind of just want them to feel comfortable enough to be able to bring something up about that person. You almost feel bad that they feel bad about you. It's a very weird dynamic. And that kind of throwing in a few different things first before it's like, oh, and Jim was so busy as well. And she does this, and Carol does this in like a polite, complimentary way, which is, it'll depend person to person and where they're at with their grief. But like, that's one of the safer bets to be able to bring something like that up, that both people there know is in the room with them as well. And it's just that extra step of being too complimentary, like, where, oh, my husband really looked up to him. And it can take just going just a little bit too far into that positive direction to kind of just really frustrate the person who has had to deal and live with the suicide that makes Helen turn like that. And I think just the structure of that, the movement of it, from having the first few minutes lead up to that, because it can't really begin with that, because that's not how a normal conversation would start, even with older people who are probably better at not letting, not putting on filters, I guess. But yeah, just how it takes time to get to there and how it deals with that mentioning. I felt that really rang true for me in trying to recall all the experiences I've had where people are unsure about how to bring something like that up.
Yeah, I think a lot of what these great scenes that we talk about are help us kind of capture in a bottle what made these series special. I think what this scene does so well for kind of the overall body of work, or body of thought that Enlightened presents to us, is that Enlightened was a show that was always very willing to be patient with uncomfortable people in uncomfortable situations to really challenge them and examine how we are affected, how we're profoundly affected by different experiences, and how no matter how much we can grow out of them or change or do things, that these things still haunt us and will still come up in unexpected places. Helen comes home after that and she's putting her groceries away, and all of a sudden we're seeing the other side of the kitchen and her husband's on the phone getting, probably the best news of his professional life because he's so excited. And then just like that, the image of that is gone. And, there's no clever visual trickery or anything like that happening in the grocery scene, but how the weight of the past of a woman that we're just starting to know, and then at the same time also the amount of past that we're given and scope of a life and a personality. For Carol, a woman that we never see again in the series as much as I can remember, is powerful. It's really striking and speaks true to actual human experience in a way that television often doesn't. Television is a great barometer for philosophy or religion or morality or any of these kind of things. Like, it's a great sandbox to play with these ideas in. But when it comes to putting those into actual moments that would happen in a day-to-day existence, I think television kind of struggles with that. I think all cinema kind of struggles with that because we're writing these things, we're not living them. But how naturally that scene feels like any other interaction that you've ever had in a grocery store, or even when you used to go home from college and people would talk to you about college and ask you what's going on there and then launch into whatever the hell was going on in their lives and whatnot at the same time, is really what made Enlightened such a special series.
The only other thing I want to mention about this sequence, it's bookended by very quick scenes in the parking lot. There's a really nice top-down shot at the beginning of it, but the one that closes it is Helen watching from her car.
Oh my God! The actual comedy of the scene.
Yeah, and why I wanted to bring that up is also one of the goals I think about doing this is to figure out how to watch things better if that's what you want to do. And with writers, there's probably a half an episode's worth of material that gets cut for every script. There are so many ideas that writers want to fit into episodes that it inevitably becomes an issue of having too much rather than not enough, which means that everything that's in there is there on purpose. And this is a great scene where if you're not used to asking, why is this happening, it's worth doing that. So why do we see, after they've had this exchange, both Helen and Carol out in the parking lot? Carol is getting helped by one of the grocery store employees to put the groceries in the trunk, and Helen is doing this by herself. I think you mentioned the comedy, and I think that there are multiple readings of that, and so I think it's good to train ourselves to take a moment and ask, well, why do I think that this scene is here?
Yeah, the comedy of that scene is just the absolute white fucking privilege of this woman. It completes the circle from her complaining about what clothes she's going to buy her upcoming third grandchild to a woman whose daughter struggles to conceive, on a fundamental level, has biological reasons why she can't give Helen a granddaughter. And then to come around to the end where her perfectly capable ass with a full family and full capabilities and a fucking iPhone before they were kind of like the most ubiquitous thing in society, it again just draws this massive chasm between two people whose lives fundamentally were, for most of their lives, were on similar paths and had a similar arc to them. And it's just, a couple little things can ripple out across the effect of a lifetime. And to see that play out in so many different ways is interesting. Do we need that final shot? Not necessarily, but I think, like I said, it completes the circle on Carol's character and Helen's experience and relationship with that woman in particular.
Yeah, it's a good visual representation of also that Carol has lived her life having people and help around her, and
she's literally carrying her own baggage around.
Yeah.
Baggage for her and others, and while this other woman has a support system to help her whenever she needs it.
Exactly.
So that will bring us to our final scene of the day. This one is the one we selected on our criteria of performance.
Direction.
Performance. We already did that. That was the first one. For some reason, I wrote down my 3 categories as acting, writing, and performance. So we'll say camera performance.
Nice save.
Just to cover my own ass. That show is The Girlfriend Experience. The episode we're talking about is Season 1, Episode 9. Christine, Blindsided. The Girlfriend Experience is the only show of these 3, which blows my mind that I can actually say this, that's still on air. It aired its first season in 2016 on Starz. It had a second season in 2018, and it'll actually be back for a third season this year. Different people will be behind it, different characters. It's an anthology series, blah, blah, blah. But it is about... it's another show, like all 3 of these, a show that operates very well on multiple layers. Siri, shut the fuck up. Why does this happen every week? Why does my watch be like, hey, you need my help, don't you? Like, fuck off. The Girlfriend Experience. On a superficial level, it's a show that's about sex work and about high-class sex work and the women that get involved in it and how it changes how they perceive themselves and how society perceives them. And often it is about how they are able to find a better definition of self through the control they get from it, especially in this first season with Christine. But it's also a show about gender dynamics and self-definition, and there's a richness in text to this that I think if we just called it, a feminist sex-positive series, that would sell a lot of it short. The second season even gets into different political things, and this first season is very much about corporate misogyny and the bro culture, kind of before it was a big thing to talk about on television shows, or even kind of society in general. But specifically the scene we're talking about here, actually I should give some more background. The episode we're talking about was written by the series co-creators Lodge Kerrigan and Amy Seimetz. I will just state for the record that I am a biased Amy Seimetz fan. She's one of my favorite people that work in the medium, so I may be a little biased towards her work. She also directed the episode. It features the scene we're talking about, features Riley Keough as Christine. And before we get into it, here's a clip.
Are you okay? Okay, let's sit you down. There you go. Okay.
What's going on? What's going on?
Someone needs to call 911.
Is she okay?
Just get her some water.
Breathe.
Please get her some water. Okay.
I'd like to have an ambulance, please.
Deep breaths.
Kirkland and
Discredit. You don't have to discredit her. She's crazy. She's discrediting herself.
Hang on. Okay, it's okay. Get her a glass of water.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that was a clip from Blindsided, the episode we've selected for direction. The scene takes place as the whole episode is one of Christine's clients leak a sex tape through her email address to everyone that she works with, and Christine's plan is to fight through this and maintain her composure. And after she is let go, she's not actually fired by them because they're too afraid to use the language. She begins to have a panic attack, or not, at her desk. It's the final scene of the episode. It is this fucking... I think of this episode reminds me of rewatching and reminded me a lot of watching Uncut Gems, because there's all this work done in sound design to give all this sound and just all this noise that Christine is trying to deal with. And this final scene, once we go from the moment of her being let go and her walking out of the office to the end of the episode, all we hear is her breathing, which on a show that features moments of actual climax or feigned climax with Christine having orgasms with her clients, this particular choice in sound design is really fascinating, but our focus here is on the direction of the episode, which I'll let you open on this one, Sean, since every one of these segments opens with me talking way too much about what we're doing.
I empathize because I've been there before. So with direction, one of the things that we should note at the top, that if you're only used to watching things and not necessarily looking up information or watching analyses or anything like that, there's a huge distinction between direction and cinematography. And I think at first, if you don't know, is there a way of saying this without sounding really condescending? If you don't know a lot about the medium in terms of like how it is composed, the director almost never is holding the actual camera. There's the director of photography, which I think is often interchangeable with cinematographer, is the one kind of designing and executing the ways in which a scene is shot, and the director is more like the captain of the ship who is in charge of making everything coalesce. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so the way I think about it is I think of the director of the episode as kind of the architect. They're the person who sees the larger skeletal structure of the episode and figures out, or even just a scene. They sit and look at the structure of a scene and say, okay, we need to look at it from this angle, and this angle to be able to create a coherent structure that people will understand at the end of it all. They give us the visual blueprint for a scene. The cinematographer are the people that are literally in charge of the camera and the crews when they're on set. Like we see a lot of shots of directors looking down cameras and whatnot. The way I interpret it is they're giving direction to where the actual frame is. Does this work? Does it fit the thematic part of this episode? And what the cinematographer has control over is how it looks, how it moves, and how it ultimately is conveyed. Like they're kind of two sides to the same coin, but their roles are distinct in that way. The cinematographer is kind of the project manager, and I look at the director as being the architect of the scene, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So I guess while I'm talking right now, if you could look up the cinematographer or director of photography so we could shout them out. But I think that both of these roles in this episode are absolutely incredible. And in this scene in particular, in which we're discussing the execution. So,
well, the girlfriend experience, the cinematography is Steven Meisler.
Okay.
Who does it.
So Meisler and Sametz do a ton of incredible work in this sequence. So the first things that I latch onto are the framing, and I'm gonna go like very maybe it's not that in depth as I think it is, but like some more language, I guess, that you can take away and think about and hopefully apply to other stuff. If you're a Westerner, as in from a Western country, Western culture, you're almost certainly used to reading from left to right, and like that's the way that our brain works in a lot of ways, and this is used in a lot of Western filmmaking, and this applies to television as well. It's kind of crazy how if you start paying attention to it, you'll notice it everywhere. Movement from left to right on the screen is usually a positive thing or is associated with our protagonist, and movement from right to left is the opposite of that stuff, essentially.
That's it. TV's ruined.
Yeah, it's so weird how it applies almost everywhere with Western stuff that you watch, but it's how that is used in this sequence is incredible. From Christine coming into the shot, moving from right to left because of how destabilized she now is, having received this information and essentially been fired. Then she moves right to her desk, which denotes like a positive shift, and it's because she's come up with this idea.
She's taking control of the situation.
She absolutely
in
is.
a very strange, underhanded, often difficult to read way, but I think that speaks to the construction of her character through the entire season, that this moment can be so ambiguous, at least on a script level. Like, I think the way we are breaking it down technically, you can get a little more of the intention out of it than I think, most viewers would read from it. But yeah, it's a very astute observation that while she moves right and sits down at her desk, even as she is projecting the notion that she has lost control of her very function of breathing and existing, that she is in more control of this situation than maybe she's ever been at this company.
And that ambiguity is there visually as well, where as she's either having or inducing this panic attack, her field of vision shifts from left to right because she's being torn between these two extremities. But by the time that she has accomplished what she's wanted to do, which is to draw all of the attention back onto her, as soon as that mask goes on and she's been given oxygen, we never see her. It's like her face is always slanted and looking towards the right. It never goes back to the left, and that's because she's done the thing that she has wanted to do in this case. And this stuff is really hard to figure out whether or not this was done intentionally, but it just feels completely right as it's happening, that there's this really chaotic movement, which is helped by it being a handheld camera rather than one that's on rails. So there's this shakiness to it, which makes total sense given what's happening to her physically and the chaos that's happening plot-wise in the episode. Like that's just the choice. It wouldn't have made sense to have it shot with a different type of camera. But then to have it really slow down when she has the oxygen and we see everybody's looking at her. We see David is looking really nervous about everything, and we don't get to see her actually smile underneath, but we infer that. Like she's won, basically, at the end of this episode, in which a lot of terrible things have happened to her.
Yeah, there's two other things with the camera that really stick out to me. There's the use of focus to kind of really cloud what's going on with her, and whether when she first starts having this panic attack, she comes in and out of focus, the background gets blurry a little bit. Like, you can tell that even as she's beginning this process of a anxiety attack, I don't think she actually knows whether it's real or if this is part of her construction of the new, Christine 2.0 that she's building, somebody who can manipulate things to her end rather than be manipulated to certain ends, as we saw with the sex tape that brings this whole thing up is her being pushed into a box by a client who wants her to behave a certain way, and she believes that the emotional transaction as part of her job is that she needs to do that. But when that is then used against her and her entire position in the office shifts, I think there's even something to compare to with the camera work that's done in this episode with her in the office as there's done in other episodes. Like especially in this sequence, there's a number of shots where we'll see people in the background judging her or even noticing her in a way that we didn't before. I think there was a sense of respect around the office for her and the things that she did. And this episode really breaks that down as people are making innuendoed comments to her and staring at her and playing the fucking video with the sound on at their desks and whatnot. And we get that comes across visually when, it'll cut to these people that are starting to form and pay attention to her. And those first few shots of her sitting down at her desk, the camera's kind of tilted down a little bit at her as if the people in this office are beginning to look down on her just as the very nature of who she is, that she's a slut, that she's a sex worker and is somebody that should be no longer respected as a colleague but derided as an object of pleasure or humor or whatever or humiliation or what it may be. But then, as you mentioned, we see David step into the frame, and he's not as confident as everybody else seems to be in their assessment of the situation. And as we do that, and as the oxygen mask gets placed on Christine, you'll notice that the camera moves a little bit more to be at Christine's eye level. And it's that moment, completely without dialogue, that you can realize that this is a situation that Christine actually has absolute control over. That despite the moment where she literally has to fight off herself passing out, which I do believe is a very real moment as all this kind of cascades over her. But her ability to come through that, it's like the moment you watch a bunch of coal get condensed into this diamond and you see it form, and then you have a completely different appreciation for the beauty of what you are beholding and the transformation you're seeing. And I think that the way that camera shifts down just a little bit to meet her at her eye level at the end is really, really striking, and how it kind of equates the audience with her and how we may have perceived her for the 20 minutes prior, and where we all end up emotionally on the same level with her at the end of the episode.
Absolutely. Like left to right and then also up and down. I don't know how obvious it is.
Like the show's about.
But if you don't have any information or knowledge about that, if the camera's is elevated above the character, that character is typically not in a position of power, vice versa. And also if a character is walking towards the screen, they're getting more powerful versus the other way around. One of the other things that I noted was how the episode evokes the sound of the breathing. And when we watch films and TV, typically the things that we're experiencing are they have to do with either the visuals or the sound. Like those are the senses to which we're being catered. And this is an instance in which you can also feel, I think, if it's done really well. And I think that it is done really well in this sequence. And there was a film from this last year. I think it was nominated for either Best Foreign or Best Animated. It was an animated film from France. The translation was I Lost My Body. And it's stuff like this where it's just really impressive in a visual medium if you can make the viewer actually almost physically feel something, like a phantom limb. And how it executes that breathing during this panic attack, like it really gets your chest tightened and you feel your breath shorten a little bit. And I think that's one of the huge parts of the sequence's success.
One of the reasons I love this show so much is how it kind of gives a fuck you to a lot of typical conventions, especially for where dramatic television was in 2016, kind of in this weird space between post-Golden Age, second streaming wars, like Netflix and Hulu had established their formulas and everybody else was kind of reacting to that. That final sequence and how it uses breathing is fascinating for me because this is a show that has a lot of sex on it. And how do we convey sex on television, or the notion of pleasure with women? For most people, it is only through heavy breathing. Not only because male creators don't know how to have females express pleasure for some reason, but also because that's kind of the only way to really give a sanitized version of pleasure without getting into the more icky things that people don't want to show us on TV because kids might watch. And how that scene flips that on its head to be like, look, we can use a woman's heavy breathing for something other than expressing pleasure, for something other than a moment of orgasm or something like that, and use it as a really personal, defining moment of somebody that's taking, like, again, I keep coming back to the phrase of taking control, but taking control of their situation. Often, again, like, I think of even, the way breathing is used on something like Spartacus sometimes. It's like, heavy breathing denotes that somebody's losing themselves in the sexuality of the moment, or just losing themselves in all the thrusting. And here, it's the breathing is used to express something completely on the opposite end of the emotional spectrum. And it is so wonderfully effective, and really helps to set up, where this season would go in its final 4 episodes.
What Kerrigan and Simons do in this series is incredible. And again, if you're interested in directing in this case, like, this is absolutely one to watch carefully. The choice of using only natural light, making certain scenes very difficult to see exactly what's going on, incredibly purposeful, incredibly effective. I said that I think all 3 of these might be in my top 10 of all time, and a lot of the technical stuff here, the decisions, the directorial decisions for the girlfriend experience are what put it there.
You want to hear some bullshit?
Let's hear some bullshit.
This is by about, if I'm looking at the numbers correctly, about 15,000 viewers, the least watched episode of this entire series.
Well, it is what it is.
And with that, I think that wraps up our first volume of our series on great scenes. This was a lot of fun. I think, we get caught up in trying to chase modern shows and figure out what makes them tick and what makes us tick when we watch them, that we forget to, I just think not us, but just as an industry, we forget to marry that to the technical aspects of what makes things good or bad. And having this series, I think, to be able to highlight some of that stuff, like, we've had an extended conversation about sound design and camera placement that I don't think would come up in just a normal episode about, do we like this show? Do we not like this show? And being able to break down things on that technical level, especially, specific sequences or moments in a TV show, are really valuable, even just personally, in my own understanding and appreciation of what television is capable of.
Yeah, I think we were a little bit worried that we might not have enough material to make a full episode, but I think doing this now, like, we could even limit it to 2 next time and really just get in there.
Yeah, it's amazing what 2 long-winded people can turn 2 minutes of television into, I guess, is the takeaway from this. But with that, I think that's going to be it for this week. This episode of the Mid-Season Replacements. If you want to listen to us, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Our opening music is from Ryan Elliott of Ancient Fears. You can find them on Facebook or Apple Music. Until next time, go enjoy some great television.